We're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone and thank Judy, Carrie, and Kristen, who you're going to get to know a lot more in their work in the webinar that's coming up now. This is, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought because I wanted to talk about something else and I just got a little confused there. My name is Carolyn Jacobs, and I'm with the Education Department at GBH. We are recording this, and we will be sending out the recording link in a follow-up email that comes to everyone who registered tomorrow. We've also compiled a very robust resource list of everything you're going to see this evening, plus a lot more. And a link to that resource document will be posted in the chat, and it will also be in the follow-up email tomorrow, along with a link to the slides. We're using Zoom Webinar as our platform, and that means that the presenters are the only ones who have the camera and the microphone. I want to acknowledge Denise Olson, who you heard a little earlier, the voice from the Outer Limits. Denise is in the chat. She's the Director of Marketing at GBH Education. And also in the chat is Lindsay Galveo from the Social Studies team, a curriculum specialist. And you'll be hearing from Lindsay a little bit later in the program. Many of you submitted questions or topics as part of your registration. Common themes for more than 80 of the questions that we got. Common themes were how to foster civil discourse, helping students recognize mis- and disinformation, and ways to connect or spur student engagement on the importance of civics and history. Some of the questions are beyond the scope of the webinar, but we really appreciate hearing from teachers because all of it is fodder for future work, and we hope to do more on this topic down the line. GBH is Boston's PBS station and the producer of many iconic series that you see on your local PBS station. And in the education department, we have been producing educational resources for more than 40 years for pre-K to 12, both formal and informal education. And we make everything available at no cost. I love being able to say, when people say, well, how much does it cost? And I say, it's free. With PBS, GBH co-founded and now co-manages the platform PBS LearningMedia, which is public media's digital learning service with thousands of free, standards-based, classroom-ready digital resources. Things like short video clips. Imagine a 60-minute American Experience or Frontline program, and then a 5-minute clip that's available for you to run in class. They're carefully edited, they tell a story, their standards align, and they're also coupled with support materials like teaching tips, discussion questions, background essay, etc. Many of the resources that you're going to see this evening are available on PBS LearningMedia. And I hope that this is a familiar site to, I'm sure it is to some of you. I hope it becomes more familiar to all of you. If you're not already signed in, please consider creating an account. It takes a minute or so. Of course, it's free. And that will then give you full access to all the features of the site. You are welcome to browse the site without logging in, but we encourage you to create an account. I am so pleased to be with these three women. They are all educator ambassadors with GBH, which is a 2-year program. And they have conceived of this webinar and organized it and are running it. And it is really a feather in their cap with the job that they have done, and you're in for a treat. The Educator Ambassador Program sponsored by GBH. If you are a Massachusetts educator and have an interest in it, let me know in the chat. And if you are in another state, many of you are, and you have an interest in connecting with your local station, and you have not already done so, and finding out what opportunities there are with PBS, let me know in the chat and I'll do my best to connect you to the right people. Carrie is a middle school teacher. She teaches geography, ancient civ, government and civics, and she's a former high school US history teacher. She's in the process of completing her second master's, this one in American history, through the esteemed Gilder Lehrman Institute. And outside of school, she works with the high school apprentice program at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts. Kristen teaches, has been teaching for 16 years. She teaches US history, AP European history, ancient history, facing history, everything history, criminal justice, and civil law. And in addition to her degrees, she earned an ed tech certificate from University of California, San Diego. And I've already benefited from her tech expertise. Outside of class, Kristen has participated in the Street Law Supreme Court program. And if you have an interest in knowing more about that, I'm sure she'd talk about it in the chat. Since 2000, Judy has served as the CVAC Chair in History at Boston Latin School, teaching interdisciplinary courses in modern history, facing history, art history, and senior capstone. I hadn't had a chance to ask Judy what the CVAC Chair is, but I looked it up, and you'll have the link to the biography of Sheldon CVAC in the resource document. And he is deceased, but quite an impressive supporter, generous friend to education, and in particular to Boston Latin. So it's wonderful that you recognize Judy for your work with him. Prior to becoming a secondary school educator, Judy was an art museum curator specializing in modern and contemporary art. And among her many awards, she was named the Boston Teacher of the Year in 2004. And Boston Latin School's students recognized her for her outstanding work in 2019. Thank you all and welcome. I really have had fun working with you. All right, our plan tonight is to explore different ways to teach freedom of speech, both national and global contexts, and to draw on public media resources as we do so. The agenda is very straightforward. Carrie will showcase how she works with middle school students to teach the First Amendment using a Why It Matters video, which you will learn about very soon. Why it matters will become a common phrase that you use. Kristen will showcase a lesson she created on PBS LearningMedia using the Lesson Builder tool that draws on Supreme Court cases. And Judy will give us a global current events perspective, drawing on an interactive lesson that is available on PBS LearningMedia about Putin's crackdown on dissidents and journalists, and also many frontline clips. And then winding down, Lindsay will come on camera and do a very brief introduction to the US History Collection, which is part of PBS LearningMedia, and we're very proud of that. I'll have a few final remarks, and we will wind out definitely by 8:15. We might close out sooner, depending upon the questions that you have, and we welcome you and encourage you to be active in the chat. And I'm going to turn things over to Carrie.
Thank you. Okay. So good evening, everyone. My name is Carrie Furtado. I am a middle school civics and social studies teacher. Like many of you, I am a teacher in an urban public school, which means I have students with a number of different learning and language abilities. And so when I think about PBS learning and I think about the ways in which I can apply this in my classroom, it's really helpful for me to know that they integrate really, really seamlessly with our LMS, which is typically Google Classroom, but they also can be adapted to better meet student learning and language needs. So the lesson I'm going to take you through is actually going to model really just what it would look like to take a resource from PBS Learning and use it the very next day in your classroom with very little adaptation needed. So before we even look at this, I wanted to just kind of give an overview of my understanding of civics and how that kind of puts a framework on what it is that we do in the classroom. So when I think about civics, it's really a combination of three things. It's that need to be informed, it's understanding your rights and responsibilities, all of which is embedded with your democratic knowledge, those foundational learning skills that we often take as our understandings from whether we're looking at how the Constitution was formed or why it is that we even have the Bill of Rights. So framing this from the idea of what is civics helps me to better look at what am I going to be teaching students and how is that going to matter? Now, I should share with you, because this might relate to some of you who have multiple classes that you're teaching. As Carolyn spoke to earlier, I teach 3 different grades. So for me, having the ability to identify resources that are easy to manage is really helpful when I'm teaching 6th grade and 7th grade geography and ancient civilization. And then I have to turn and suddenly I'm looking at civics, foundational knowledge, project learning. There's a lot of different components, and having the resources from PBS is incredibly helpful. Next slide, Carolyn. And so our focus here is going to be teaching the importance of the First Amendment. And it's really important knowing the First Amendment and what are the reasons why we included the First Amendment in the Constitution. So before we go any further, you have a little bit of work to do as the students in the classroom. So on your screen will pop up a poll. Let's see if you can select the correct option that identifies the freedoms that are protected by the First Amendment. And I hope no one's Googling the answers because that would be a little unfair. Right, we're going to wrap up the poll in about 15 seconds. And the correct response was very good. We have 96% who identified that the 5 protections are speech, religion, assembly, petition, and the press. And so typically in my classroom, that's one of the areas as we're looking now at the First Amendment and its evolution, making sure that students understand what it is that students need to know. What are those freedoms that are protected according to the First Amendment? So if you've already had the opportunity to teach the First Amendment, the next resource that we're going to look at is actually directly from PBS LearningMedia. It's our Defining Free Speech and Why It Matters. And so when we think about free speech, it's more than just having that speech, it's also why it matters. So PBS has provided this resource, and embedded within the resource, we have materials for both teachers and for students. So on the next few slides, we're going to take a look at what this will look like. Now, the items you're seeing on your screen, this is the landing page. If you were to go to PBS LearningMedia, I believe there's a link directing you there in the chat. And if you look directly here, you'll notice, first of all, it's part of the U.S. History Collection. Now, you might be wondering, what's a civics teacher doing with resources from a U.S. History Collection? Well, for me, there are some overlapping standards that will help to, define free speech and also the expansion of free speech. So I did find some resources directly from the U.S. History Collection that I was able to implement in a civics classroom. And so what we'll see from the teacher perspective are the teaching tips, which you'll notice is your essential question. We then have supporting questions, which break down what are the learning targets for students. there are specific historical thinking skills. And then for me, I aligned this to our Massachusetts framework standards. And because this is a resource that's directed to US history, I did have to look at where this would align with civics. And I found that in our fifth topic, subtopic 2, where we're looking at the preamble and the Bill of Rights, that was where this would best be aligned with our curriculum. And so the nice thing is knowing that PBS, it's adaptable. So some of the prior knowledge as spelled out with the resource is students should have an understanding of what the Bill of Rights is and why it was created. And as you already pointed out so correctly in our poll question, what the First Amendment is and the rights that are protected. And then there needs to be that understanding of what are the roles and responsibilities of the Supreme Court when ruling on constitutional issues. So this is what students should be coming to the lesson already having a knowledge of. And for students who have this knowledge, PBS provides a resource in the student materials that helps to bridge what they already know with what specifically we'd like them to know for this particular lesson. And so I wanted to point out our background knowledge here. First of all, this is an adaptation of the resource as provided by PBS, and the only alterations that I made were some language alterations, knowing that some of the specific terms might be more difficult for students. I do like to have them be challenged, but if I think a word is going to be too complex, I might just adapt that. Now, this was copied and again, just adapted very simply. And what I would ask students to do prior to watching the video is to take maybe 5 minutes at the start of our class and read through a very brief excerpt on the evolving definition of free speech. And now we're going to take a look at the video. And what I would normally do when presenting this video with students is I've already looked ahead at what are the discussion questions that are aligned with the video. So we're going to take some time and take the role of students, and we're going to see if we can respond to the questions at the appropriate times in the video.
Hey everyone, I'm your host, Malik Mercier, and this is GBH's Why It Matters, the history series where we use the past to explain the present. It seems like lately the news is full of stories about clashes over our right to express ourselves.
So we're here, and we're gonna make that point, and we're not leaving.
There's everything from book banning, to Twitter suspensions, to controversies over campus speakers. But what does freedom of speech really mean? And how has it evolved since the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791? Here to talk about the history of free speech and to help us connect the past to the present is Professor Chris Capozzola. Dr. Capozzola, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Why did the framers of the Constitution believe that freedom of speech was such an essential right that they listed it in the First Amendment? Why was it so important?
There's a historical reason, right, that almost everything in the Bill of Rights is something that the founders thought that the British had taken away from them or prevented them from having. Then there's also a real sort of structural thing that they wanted to do. They thought, well, if we're going to have a democracy, if we're going to engage in this democratic experiment, we're going to need ideas. And we're going to need to make sure that the best ideas get out there so that we can hear them, so that we can make the best decisions if we're going to trust people to govern themselves.
What is the purpose of free speech?
Free speech is something we need in order to run a democracy, right? You can't have voting, you can't have debate, you can't have deliberation if people can't speak and say what they want.
Okay, so at this point in the video, I would ask for our students to either in a whole class discussion or maybe turn and talk with their neighbors. And I would repeat the question, what is the purpose of free speech? And so if you want to take a moment in the chat and you want to share your thoughts on why it is that we have free speech and what that is, that can simulate a little of what this would feel like in the classroom from the student perspective. So I apologize, it's not on screen right now, but the question would be, what is the purpose of free speech in a democracy? Seeing some really good ideas generating that conversation, testing out ideas, encouraging new ideas, discussion, and all of those were so important when you're talking about framing of the Constitution and why it is that this exchange of ideas needed to take place. And it provides such a great opportunity for students to really process and think about this. So we're going to watch a little bit more of the video, and then we're going to start to talk about how we transition from civics to the ideas of U.S. history and law.
Free speech. This is a really crucial turning point in American history. Before the First World War, and even during the war, a lot of people just didn't have the rights of free speech that the Constitution said that they did, despite the First Amendment being on the books. In World War I, it gets really tough. This is an unpopular war, and President Wilson imposes a series of restrictions that say you can't speak out against the war, you can't criticize the war effort, you can't criticize military draft, and in response, there is significant repression. Newspapers are shut down for anti-war speakers. Out of this crisis of the First Amendment come new movements for civil liberties, and even the phrase civil liberties is a product of the First World War. Organizations of pacifists, of women suffragists, of ethnic minorities, all of these groups are coming together in new ways to kind of advocate for free speech. In the 1920s, they lose more battles than they win, but they set up some of the real sort of new ideas and priorities.
And so we would start to ask the questions about not only our own definitions of free speech, but also how it is that the Supreme Court has had a role in this evolving definition of free speech, both its expansion and contraction over time when we consider the different needs of the nation, depending on whether we're at war, whether we are struggling with a domestic crisis. There's so many different ways that the Supreme Court has had a role. And this is another great opportunity to discuss how it is that these things are happening. And it also, because we know that students already have that Supreme Court knowledge, it helps to reinforce that understanding of your checks and balances, understanding of the process within the country that was intended by the Constitution. Okay. Then, so one of the last cases that's highlighted in this particular video with free speech and why it matters is one that you'll actually see discussed a little further with our next presenter, Kristen, and she's going to talk about the Tinker versus Des Moines case. And that's just one other piece that I wanted to mention is so many of these resources, because they have many different layers and many different applicable angles. You can see this from your Supreme Court angle. You can see this from constitutional law. You can see this from civics. You can see this from U.S. history. There's so many different ways that you can integrate and you can embed these resources, even if it's the same resource. I think we can go ahead to the next slide. And so the last piece is really just, as we wrap up this, the video portrayal, and we discuss this as a class, where we might leave off in the classroom are these discussion questions that are partnered with the video, such as the role that students have had. And this will be expanded when we look more closely at the Tinker versus Des Moines case. Do you agree with Dr. Capizzola? And, this always is a question, should there in fact be limits on free speech? And it's amazing to see the responses that you'll get from the resources. And I'm so happy that I was able to share this resource. And as I said, I'm that teacher on the go. I'm always moving. And it truly is great to be able to share this. And it's one of those that you could drop right into your class tomorrow and it's ready to go. And so with that, I am going to turn things over to Kristen, who is going to share with you her expertise in high school history and social studies and some other key components to using PBS.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I loved your presentation too, and I can totally see myself using that with high schoolers as well as with middle schoolers. So thank you. So hi, everybody. My name is Kristen McManus. I teach at the high school level. I teach in a small town called Harvard, Massachusetts, in a small rural/suburban public school. I am in my 16th year of teaching, and I have taught both at the middle school level and at the high school level. And in my career, I've taught over 10 different courses. So the lesson that I'm presenting to you today, I recently used in my civil law class, but I could see using it in a US history class or perhaps a legal studies or a government class as well. And so we put 2 questions up in the chat for you, and I'd love to hear, for those of you who might use Supreme Court cases, what the value you see is in using those cases in your class, and what methods do you use currently to make the cases accessible to your students. So while you're typing those responses in the chat, I'll tell you a quick story because I'm a history teacher. We like to tell stories. So at my school, I took over teaching at the high school level from someone who was retiring, and he was a practicing defense attorney for 20 plus years before he had a career change to become a high school teacher. Now, upon his retirement, he handed me a 3-inch binder full of case law and said, here you go, here's the textbook that I used. And I do not fault him. He was a phenomenal teacher. And I know that I'm a well-educated person myself. But as I was reading through these cases, I sometimes struggled with some of the legalese that you see in some of these SCOTUS cases, and then pondered, how can I make that accessible to my students, particularly my students who are differently abled and perhaps might not be able to read at that very, adult reading level. And so the lesson that I've crafted today is one way that I have adapted my teaching. So I see lots of things in the chat. I am very excited to go back and look to see if I can get more ideas on how to teach SCOTUS in the class. So thank you so much. So personally, the more I taught Supreme Court cases in my classroom, the more I began to love them. And I actually noticed that my students really do too. So I see that there's value in showcasing real life and relevant application of the law. And students can begin to see the impact that the Supreme Court has had on their own lives and in our country. And luckily, there is an abundant amount of Supreme Court cases to draw from to use during class as well. So I teach teenagers, and I know many of you do too. And I think I'm not alone in saying that we know that teenagers tend to be more interested in themselves and how something impacts them directly. So it can be difficult to relate these cases to their own lives. And so for that reason, I, of course, still teach the standards, but try to expand that if possible to allow them to apply the cases to things in their own life. So for our lesson today, I'm going to give you a sample lesson. The objectives will be to showcase a lesson that utilizes a fantastic tool on PBS LearningMedia, which I honestly stumbled upon myself just very recently. And it allows students to think critically about what protest looks like and what it does not look like. And then they will use a primary source to look at an important event during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. They'll compare 2 cases of the Supreme Court of the US, aka SCOTUS, and then they'll look at ways in which protest and free speech in schools can be and cannot be limited as well. So these are the standards that I'm addressing in this lesson, and these I actually copied and pasted right off of the PBS LearningMedia video pages. So you'll note that when you're searching for lessons and videos, the standards are linked right to the resources. So the standards on the right side of the slide are, of course, from Massachusetts, where I teach, and they automatically show up because when I have logged into my PBS LearningMedia account, I actually choose my local station, which is GBH, and therefore it detects automatically that I am located in Massachusetts. So if you have not created a login to PBS LearningMedia, I would recommend that you do the same, and you'll see that it's similarly aligned. And when you log in, you'll see also that there are national standards for civics, for government. It's going to, of course, depend on the particular resource that you use. So without further ado, here is how I would use PBS LearningMedia. And then full disclosure, I did use this lesson with my class just a few weeks ago, and I have some student testimonials later on as well. Now, when you click into your account on PBS LearningMedia, you'll see that you have several options that include navigating to your dashboard. You can set favorites, which is awesome. I use my favorites list all the time. You can create folders and so much more. And so for this lesson, I actually use the lesson builder feature. And this can be accessed on the lesson builder by the assignments page, or on the right-hand side, you'll see on the dashboard page as well. Now on the assignments page, for example, there's a button that says build a new lesson to start a new one. And here on this screen, you'll see that I've already built my lesson. So it's in the awaiting assignment part because I did not assign it to my classes just yet. So for this lesson on on free speech, I am using a pivotal Supreme Court case from 1965 called Tinker v. Des Moines. And if you don't already know that case, it has to do with a group of students who decided to protest the Vietnam War by wearing armbands at school. I don't want to spoil the ending for you if you don't know the case, and I would encourage you to look at the many videos that PBS LearningMedia has on it. But for this case, rather than ask the students to read the case law itself, which can be challenging at really any grade level, I decided to sort of hit two birds with one stone. I want them to learn about the case, but then I decided to put it to them in video form, which just so happens to also be a primary source. So the video on your left-hand side is from a series where Mary Beth Tinker actually discusses how and why she participated in the 1965 protests. So it's a firsthand account. It checks off that box of integrating a primary source. And it's also a short video. You'll see that there are actually several short clips in the series. And this one's only 4 minutes and 13 seconds. The second video on the right, I decided to use, it's a more recent Supreme Court case called Mahanoy Area School District VBL. And this happened in 2021. I will usually refer to it with my students as a Snapchat cheerleader case. So what happened is it involved a high school cheerleader who did not make the cheerleading squad. So she posted a Snapchat video of herself cursing at the school. And this video is actually from PBS NewsHour, and it's only 5 minutes and 32 seconds. So once you have researched your resources and you can actually start to sort of dive in and begin building your lesson, you're able to integrate these PBS LearningMedia videos right into the lesson. So you can, just select it when you go to add new media. It will include the title, the text, and any other embedded links that you have too. In addition, you can add questions after the videos, which it could include fill in the blank, multiple choice, short answer, true, false, or essay questions too. And then you can type your questions right in the text box. And so some of these questions I had developed on my own or through the years and other curriculum resources. And some of them I actually drew directly from PBS LearningMedia itself. So for example, when you search up the Snapchat cheerleader case, the video already has discussion questions and background reading attached to the page, much like you saw in Carrie's lesson as well. So I decided to use some of these discussion questions within my lesson. And I should also note that on the left-hand side, you'll see that the standards, that's where they are. They're linked right at the bottom of the video. And one more important thing to add is that it's really actually just so easy to add more things to the lesson. So at first I decided just to use the Tinker case because that's of course my bread and butter when speaking about student protests. But then I remember my students being really fascinated when they heard about the Snapchat cheerleader case. So I decided to add that by clicking on the media slide. However, you could also add more questions or you could add a text slide as well. So this is how it looks like from the student's perspective. It's super user-friendly, super interactive. The students are walked through it step by step, and they can navigate back pages and forward pages as they wish. So please check out the link, which will be posted in the lesson so you can see what it looks like from the student's perspective. Now, to bring this all back to how I relate this to free speech, as part of a lesson, prior to this one, I usually ask students to brainstorm what protest does look like and what it does not look like. And I often do this in groups so they can kind of bounce ideas off of each other before we do a share out in a large group discussion. So for the first few questions in this particular lesson, I ask the students to reiterate what protest looks like and does not look like. And I ask them to apply that to the Tinker case. So for example, when Mary Beth Tinker wore an armband, how does that look like protest, or how can that be considered free speech? And then after the students watch the second video, I ask them to think about free speech outside of school and whether the school has the right to punish someone for expressing a thought outside of school. So when somebody puts a Snapchat story up that this teen created, right, and she was upset and so on, how does that fit protest? How does that look like protest, or perhaps does it not look like protest? Now, we live in the age of social media, so this poses a really interesting question. And the courts, as we know, are starting to sort of evolve with the times as well when it comes to this stuff. I also really encourage the students to discuss and to think about how student protests should be limited inside school or outside school, or should it be limited at all? And this particular case really piques the interest of the students, and it definitely gets them fired up when they're discussing it. So on this slide, as you see, there are some student testimonials. I will say, I asked my students on a Google form after the fact, hey, what did you think about this lesson? And they really actually loved it. They said that the video lengths were great. They were just long enough, not too long. They said, oh, it's way better than reading from a textbook and answering questions or doing case studies and reading from a textbook. And I really appreciated this lesson, and I appreciated their feedback, because it takes these difficult cases and it boils it down into interesting videos for the students. For those students who might have learning disabilities or might have, be English language learners, this video is a resource that meets their needs as well. I also love that it allows students to pause the video, watch parts of it again, to go back and forth with the questions. And this lesson works wonderfully in class, but it's also great for homework assignments or perhaps sub-plans, as long as students have the internet access. And one very important thing that I forgot to mention was that we are a Google school and we use Google Classroom, and it links actually pretty seamlessly with Google Classroom too. So I can put the link up, the students can submit it, and it makes for really easy integration. So a question for you all in the chat is, have you used this lesson builder feature before in your own classroom? I'd love to hear more about it, because like I said, I'm sort of dipping my toes in the water. And so I'm excited to hear what others might be doing in their classrooms as well. All right. Well, thank you so much. I would love to turn it over to my colleague, Judy Freeman, who is going to tell you a little bit more about free speech in a global context.
Right. Thank you, Kristen. That was great. So I'm Judy Freeman. I teach history at Boston Latin School, which is proud to say it's the oldest public school in the country. And I teach both modern and contemporary history, as well as art history, and senior capstone at this school. What I'm going to talk about today relates as well to a variety of the standards. And on this slide, you can see both the Massachusetts standards, the world history standards, and the national standards for civics and government that this pertains to, as well as the C3 framework. In other words, all of the lessons that we're doing today directly link to standards that pre-exist. Let's go to the next slide. So how I use PBS LearningMedia and/or PBS resources in the classroom relates directly to my passion for two particular PBS vehicles. One is PBS Frontline series, which I just adore, and the other is PBS NewsHour, which is such a reflective, thoughtful way of presenting current events. And in talking about freedom of speech for this session, I thought it would be interesting to look at how current events plays out in countries other than the United States, how we see restraint or restriction on freedom of speech, and how could we make use of the extraordinary media sources that PBS provides to leverage those and use them effectively in the classroom. So let's take a look first at a case study. And I'm very fond as a teacher of creating kind of mini case studies. In this case, we'll be looking at Russia. PBS has been covering Russia both on PBS NewsHour extensively for obvious reasons, but in particular, in light of our focus here on freedom of speech, it's important to look at the current situation of a Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan Gershkovich, who is currently under arrest and being detained on espionage charges in Moscow. Now, the reality is that Gershkovich is a journalist. His rights to report, which in theory, in a country like ours, in theory, are unchallenged due to our First Amendment rights, are obviously being challenged both for a political reason in Russia. We're obviously on the side of Ukraine, and Russia is not terribly happy with us right now, as well as an overall denial of freedom of speech and expression. So one of the things in light of what we're going to talk about is follow that story. PBS NewsHour has umpteen resources on it, and there's a link provided in the article that's linked here. Let's go to the next slide. But if you want an extraordinary piece of media integrated with lesson planning, take a look at PBS LearningMedia's interactive lesson related to a film that was part of a Frontline series called Putin's War at Home. The interactive lesson focuses specifically on Putin's crackdown on anti-war activists in a number of fields. The clips that have been curated for this interactive lesson are just exceptional. And what you do in using the interactive lesson, which is linked here, is to go through a series of pages that provide background, etc., and then you get meticulously created clips. For my students, and I teach juniors and seniors, I can use typically a 3 to 5 minute clip. And if it's engrossing, and these are engrossing, they are golden. So let's take a look at this first clip that introduces us to two women who are based in St. Petersburg, Sonia Sobotina and Sasha Skochelenko, and their story related to their role as anti-war activists. Oop, can we go back? I don't know what just happened. Let's get the first film link.
Моему стыду сейчас я очень долгие годы не интересовалась политикой. Но когда началась война в Украине, все очень сильно изменилось. Мы с Сашей познакомились 5,5 лет назад. Саша ко мне переехала, и мы стали жить с ней как семья. Мы поняли, что молчать на этот счет невозможно, и мы пошли на митинг рядом с гостиным двором. Я хотела сказать «нет» войне. Любой человек не мог предположить, что в конце февраля начнутся такие события и политические репрессии так широко развернутся в нашей стране.
Independent polls show that a majority of Russians say that they support the war, but there's a large, often silent population that doesn't. Putin's laws have effectively made it a crime to oppose the war.
За слова «нет» войне, они у нас считаются экстремизмом, тебя могут посадить на 10-15 лет в тюрьму. Это хорошо объясняет то, почему сотни тысяч, например, не выходят на протесты. Всех, кто не согласен, у нас избивают, арестовывают, сажают в тюрьму, пытают и так далее.
Amid the crackdown on dissent, Sasha, an artist, found a new way to express her opposition.
Я хорошо помню тот день, когда Сашу арестовали. Но идея с антивоенными стикерами вместо ценников, она была довольно известной в России в свое время. Эти стикеры, они очень напоминают обычные магазинные ценники, только вместо цены там числа, которые связаны с войной в Украине. Я думаю, что Саша тоже увидела где-то в интернете эти фотографии и решила повторить. Саша оставила 5 антивоенных стикеров в магазине. Причиной ее ареста стал как раз ценник с информацией про жертвы в Мариуполе. Дело в том, что в официальной повестке говорится о том, что этого не было, а, соответственно, это считается фейком против российской армии и подходит под уголовную статью. А после этого на нее написала донос пенсионерка. По камерам видеонаблюдения ее нашли и проследили ее дорогу до дома этого друга.
Sasha has been in jail awaiting trial ever since her arrest.
Great. So what's wonderful about a clip like that is that it then, let's go to the next slide, it then offers the opportunity for some really terrific questions. I posed 2 here, and I'm a big fan of the turn and talk strategy as well, where I pair up students and ask them to share their responses to the clip, and then kind of meta questions, like what are autocratic leaders like a Putin afraid of? What do they fear? And what are the risks, which are clearly presented in that clip? And then if we go even more meta in the discussion, what does this tell you about constricted speech? And how does that compare to the rights we have here in this country? It's a brilliant strategy that that young artist had. And yet look at what she risked to use her voice to make that statement. My students all year have been following what's going on in Ukraine. And so these clips were incredibly powerful for them. Let's go to the next slide. The interactive lesson has multiple clips. I'm going to show you just one more. This one's a tiny bit longer. And now we're going to Siberia, where we're going to meet 2 journalists who were unbelievably courageous in wanting the people in their region to know what was really happening in Ukraine, what the Russian forces were doing there, despite the risks to their own livelihood and their own daily existence. So let's go to that second clip.
Two journalists working in this remote region of Siberia have agreed to talk. Since the war began, they have been reporting on Russian military deaths, despite a national ban on doing so.
What they're doing is exactly what the Russian government doesn't want journalists to do. They travel around their region to document the deaths of Russian soldiers in Ukraine. I'm actually surprised to see them not in jail.
Понимаете ли вы, что вы потенциально рискуете уголовным наказанием на срок от 8 до 15 лет за распространение недостоверной информации о российских вооруженных силах, также за сотрудничество с иностранными медиа?
Я понимаю, что потенциально я могу быть наказана.
Я понимаю, что могу быть наказана.
Заняв такую позицию, в принципе, мы можем, наверное, сломать себе всю жизнь.
Мой мозг отказывался верить, что война началась и что это произошло. Не понимала.
Вот это самое главное, чтобы было понятно. Ну, просто не оставили никаких шансов поступить иначе. Риски в сфере безопасности создали такие, что другими средствами отреагировать было невозможно.
А сейчас будет введена цензура. Сейчас просто позакрываются все независимые СМИ. 2 года назад мы с Олей Мутовиной придумали интернет-журнал «Люди Байкала». 24 февраля мы решили, что у нас по-прежнему не будет цензуры. Вот. Чего бы нам это ни стоило.
The area around Lake Baikal is home to an ethnic minority, the Buryats. The Russian military draws heavily from this area. The reporters showed us footage they filmed just over a month after the invasion. The bodies of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine were being taken for burial.
Наверное, здесь я встал, да?
Может,
лишь туда подъехать.
Military deaths are classified as state secrets in Russia, and the government rarely releases figures.
Было очевидно, что мы ни о чем другом писать просто не можем. Если люди узнают о том, какие потери мы на самом деле несем на Украине, то, наверное, многие из них изменят свое отношение к спецоперации и перестанут себя чувствовать гражданами великой страны.
Olga and Yelena learned that a nearby sports complex was being used as a funeral hall. They managed to get inside and film.
Спокойно прошла и увидела сначала один гроб, и вокруг люди, потом второй гроб, и третий, и четвертый. И это был шок.
Olga and Yelena reported the names of the dead soldiers on their website. They also wrote about the impact of the war on the local community. The region is estimated to have one of the highest casualty rates from the war in the country. The government blocked Russians from accessing the website, claiming the journalists were spreading inaccurate information.
И все. А никто у нас не пишет истории, например, об этих людях. Никто не пишет интервью с их матерями, с семьями, не делает об этом ничего.
But the journalists continued their investigation into military deaths in Ukraine. They began building a database of hundreds of Russian fighters from this area killed in the war.
Ну, какая может быть демократия, если человек вообще не может сказать ничего против?
My students were so moved by that, and they brought it up. They watched it a few weeks ago, and today it came up again because today it was revealed that there are 20,000 troops, Russian troops, who died in the taking of Bakhmut in Ukraine. We know about that in the West. Certainly the Ukrainians know about that. Do the Russian people know about that? And these women took incredible chances. So the discussion questions for students here are many, but certainly what's the effect of trying to quash the reporter's freedom to report in general? And what does this reveal more broadly about the freedom of speech and freedom of expression in Russia? Let's say you didn't want to talk about Russia. Let's say you wanted to try another case study. In the case of the next slide, let's say, and I just skipped over this, so let me just go back for a moment. You could broaden out that question to use it as a way to dive into current events in a country like Russia to better reflect on what's happening here in the United States. But let's go into that second case study. In the case of China. In China, journalists face similar challenges. The Uyghurs are a minority population which has been thrown into camps in the western part of the country, and information is very difficult to come by in terms of getting the stories of what's happening to the Uyghurs out. In another PBS Frontline episode, this one from 2020 called China Uncover, you can use a clip, and we're going to look at it, finally a very short clip that's 3 minutes and 25 seconds that show us what these journalists are facing in China.
Şu hiç qanday bir narsani tushundirmay tashlayapti. O'zi qo'rqib turganligi, qo'rqib so'zlaganligi anlanib turdi.
Sadurjan's become a vocal advocate for Uyghur rights.
Adam bo'lganda shu Uyg'urlar, Qozoqlar bizning shu dinga aloqador millatlar. То есть азыркы Шинжаң бүтүнлөй üstü oçuk bir türme.
Xinjiang is the region of China just beyond this border. It means new territory. Uyghur Muslims, with their own culture and language, have been living there for over 1,000 years. But the territory was invaded by China's Qing dynasty around 250 years ago and brought under Chinese control. The regime tightly guards access to Xinjiang, and journalists are not able to work freely there. We decide to go undercover. We've been warned that Uyghurs are under regular surveillance and foreigners would be followed. Here in northern Thailand, we are introduced to someone willing to help. A businessman who often works with journalists. He's part of China's Han ethnic majority, which will give him more freedom to travel and film. But it's still dangerous. We're disguising his voice and calling him Lee.
所以呢，我觉得这个工作室虽然是很有挑战性，但是意义重大。所以呢，我们也会特别的小心，这件事情对我们来说也会特别的紧张。
If caught secretly filming, he could be imprisoned.
我们要去见证一个真实的新疆的情况。
Xinjiang is China's largest region. While Uyghurs and other Muslims are the majority, for over 60 years the government has encouraged Han Chinese to settle here. They make up around 40% of the population. In early 2019, Lee touches down in the regional capital, Urumqi.
"新疆对我来说是一个很神秘的地方，然后感觉就是非常的紧张。然后我到了以后，感觉基本上到处都是警察。"
Great. And thank you. There's a great comment that Lisa made in the chat, which is exactly the point here. Let's turn to the questions one might pose with students in the next slide. So, for example, how can you get this news out? And what risks do journalists take? They're considerable. So if we then go to the next slide, we take those two case studies, one or the other or both. So what does it mean when press freedoms are challenged, when freedom of expression is restricted? Use those two countries as examples. And then again, go back and use that to think about what's happening in our own country. So let's take a moment. And if you have a bulleted response to either one or the other question or both, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll just take a minute to do that. Let's take another few seconds. Yep. Absolutely, Michael. I think in general, and Lisa said this very well in her comment earlier, this is showing us what free speech isn't. And therefore, it allows us to turn back to our own country and reflect on this. I picked 2 case studies for the sake of tonight, but if you wanted to take a look at any of the other resources that I found where there were clips that I thought were incredibly useful and interesting related to Hungary, the Philippines, El Salvador, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea, any or all of those would work very effectively in, again, making that point. What isn't freedom of speech? And what is it about the right that we have that we need to protect and guard and preserve? So these are resources that are available to you on the resources we're going to share, as well as the slide deck having all the live links that you're also going to receive. And I hope that you'll consider using global material to inform whatever you do in your classroom about the local and national lenses that our students have considering their own rights. I'll be really curious to see what people do with this. So I'm going to turn things over to Lindsay right now, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you for all of our presenters. And thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time to join us tonight. We know it's a very busy time of year, and we're honored that you decided to spend some time with us this evening and participate in our webinar. So as we're winding down the evening, first, I invite you to share in the chat one takeaway that you have from this presentation, maybe a resource you're looking to incorporate in your classroom, maybe a resource you'd like to explore further in depth, or some other ideas that you have that have sparked new ways that you want to bring our resources into your classroom. As you're doing that, I would like to tell you a little bit more about our U.S. History collection before we officially close out our evening. I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing you pieces of our U.S. History collection, which is on PBS LearningMedia. Carrie gave you a sneak peek tonight in her portion of our webinar, so I'm excited to give you a closer look. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of background and some key points about our U.S. History collection. Here you will find over 400 curated, supplemental, and media-driven resources centered on teaching U.S. history through both core historical topics and diverse historical perspectives. The U.S. History collection contains thoroughly researched and fact-checked historical content that also emphasizes skill building and contains flexible teacher and student support materials. So let's take a quick moment to head to our website live and see a little bit more of what's in the U.S. History collection. Great, thank you, Carolyn. The U.S. History collection is organized by 16 eras with input from teachers around the country like you who are attending tonight. These eras are very familiar to U.S. history teachers. I'm sure you've seen them before. Use similar eras in your own classroom. You can search the collection in many different ways. You can look in our browser, search browser for a specific name, a place, an event, or you can actually look through resources through an era. Each era is broken down into 4 to 5 subtopics to further aid you in finding what you're looking for. Because it's supplemental in nature, all of these resources are meant to enhance and support your current classroom curriculum. You can also browse the resources by the 9 historical thinking skills, which we created at GBH in response to teachers' requests for resources that help teach skills as well as content. Many of the resources are accompanied by student activities that focus on one of the historical thinking skills, giving students the opportunity to use media to develop that skill set further. No matter the type of resource, whether it's a video, an interactive lesson, an interactive image, a map, or a timeline, each one leads with media. We think that it is a more accessible source of historical information for a diverse student body. Finally, we designed and wrote new support materials for all of the resources in the U.S. History collection. Every resource has teaching tips and discussion questions. In addition to the student activities I've already mentioned, almost half of the resources have student background readings, which provide historical context for students. It also deepens student understanding of historical content by promoting inquiry and by placing students at the center of their own learning. And finally, we are thrilled to be in the process of creating a new civics collection, which will be similar in scope and sequence to our U.S. history collection. We cannot wait to unveil this collection to you all, and please stay tuned for more. Carolyn, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, I am overwhelmed, as I imagine many of you are also. Thank you to our three wonderful educator ambassador presenters. Great job, ladies. And thank you to all of you for being a part of this evening. As a reminder, everything that you, many of the resources that you saw are available on PBS LearningMedia, along with thousands more, and that's where you'll find the U.S. History Collection also. These are just banners that show different collections that are on PBS LearningMedia, just to give you an idea of the variety. So I chose a few that are of interest to social studies teachers. And a collection on the site is a curated grouping of resources that all relate to a topic or something. So you go to one URL and then you have many resources to choose from. Okay, we pay close attention to your feedback, and we have learned and changed the way we do things based on what you tell us. So there should be a link in the chat for the survey. The QR code should work. The link here should work. And at the end of taking this brief survey, you can download a certificate of attendance if you would like. We do get great ideas from the surveys about other topics that interest you, along with what you put into the registration form. And I also stumble upon teachers who are interested in being presenters with us. If you've ever been on our webinars, we always involve teachers, and we're always looking for teachers who would like to showcase their practice and work with us. This is just a quick document that shows you the link to the slide deck, the resource document, the post-webinar survey, and to sign up for our newsletter if you're not already on our email list. And all of these links will come out in that the follow-up email tomorrow. All right, so we are at our time, but I wanted to give Denise and Lindsay, who've been in the chat, and just an opportunity to bring anything up that you would like, and we'll keep the chat open for a little while, and then we'll wish you all a lovely evening.
So Stephen just posted a question asking if we offer reading level variations for our resources. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information on our student background readings, which you can find in our U.S. History collection and with many other resources on PBS LearningMedia. These are written at a 9th grade reading level. These are for you in Microsoft Word, which allows you to edit and change these readings as you see fit. We call out key vocabulary terms and define them for your students. And we actually use students to create these student background readings where they gave us input on the readability of the document, the font color, the text we used, how easy it was for them to digest and understand the information. And so again, it was curated with the support of students, and all of the student background readings contain an essential question, which is meant to center student learning as they read the material. So that way you have a lot of flexibility in incorporating it, adapting it, using them in your classroom. They're usually about 1 to 2 pages in length.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to put my email in the chat. You are welcome to email me for any questions you have about GBH or PBS or PBS LearningMedia. If you, at the beginning of the program, I talked about our ambassador program. If you're a Massachusetts educator and would like to learn a little bit more about that, let me know. And if you are not in Massachusetts, as many of you are not, and are interested in working with your local station in some capacity and finding out what the opportunities are, let me know about that too. All right, thank you again, ladies. Wonderful job. I'll be in touch with you tomorrow. I know we're all ready to sign off and get a big drink of water and enjoy the rest of our evening. And thank you to all of you. I know that you are winding down or have already ended the school year. And it's very impressive that you took some time on a school night to join us. So thank you.